the storm swallowed the world whole. Beyond the rattling hull of the snowcat, there was only a howling, white oblivion, a furious Alaskan blizzard that erased the very concept of horizon. John, a man whose life had recently been defined by the arid dust of foreign deserts, felt a deep, primal chill seep through the insulated walls. This was his new posting, a place not found on any public map, a secret buried under ice and sworn oaths. Permafrost Base. The vehicle lurched to a halt before a massive, featureless metal door set into the side of a mountain. It slid open with a low groan, revealing a cavernous airlock. The transition was jarring. The screaming wind was instantly muted, replaced by the sterile hum of powerful machinery and the hiss of pressurization. Two figures in bulky environmental suits directed him out, their faces obscured behind visors. The decontamination process was brutal in its efficiency. Blasts of frigid, chemical-laced air scoured his outer gear, followed by UV lights that left purple ghosts dancing behind his eyelids. Every step was monitored, every breath logged. He was being stripped, not just of potential contaminants, but of his former identity. John the Army technician was being processed into a component of permafrost. When the inner door hissed open, a man stood waiting. He was built like a bulldog, with a square jaw and eyes that held no warmth, only assessment. Security Chief Miller. He dispensed with any greeting, his voice a low, gravelly thing that seemed designed for giving orders in confined spaces. Miller's briefing was a study in controlled menace. He spoke of the absolute necessity of secrecy, of protocols that were not suggestions, but commandments. The world outside, he implied, was not to be discussed, nor was the specific nature of the work conducted in the deeper sectors. John's assignment was straightforward: maintain the geothermal power systems that kept the lights on and the cold at bay. It was a job he was qualified for, a return to the mechanical puzzles he understood. But as Miller spoke, John felt the weight of the mountain. Above them, a crushing pressure of rock and ice. This was not just isolation. It was imprisonment with a paycheck. Miller finally dismissed him, assigning a temporary bunk. As John walked the corridors, the feeling of oppression intensified. The walls were a seamless, antiseptic white, broken only by numbered hatches and the occasional blinking panel. The air tasted recycled, carrying a faint metallic tang. The constant, low-frequency hum of the geothermal plant was a vibration he felt in his bones, a perpetual reminder of the fragile artificiality of their environment. He passed other personnel, their eyes sliding away from his, their expressions carefully neutral. There were no casual greetings, no shared smiles, just the hum, the sterile light, and the silent, watchful presence of the security cameras tracking his every move. This was the tone of his new life, a silent, humming dread debris deep beneath the ice. The days at Permafrost Base bled into one another, a seamless gray tapestry woven from routine and repetition. John's life quickly narrowed to a series of prescribed actions, a rigid dance performed under the unblinking gaze of the facility's surveillance system. His world became the labyrinth of service corridors surrounding the geothermal plant, a realm of throbbing pipes and the ozone scent of high-voltage electricity. His morning began with the same jarring electronic tone from the comms panel. He would rise from his narrow cot, the thin mattress offering little comfort, and pull on his standard-issue coveralls. The first task was always the power relay check. For 2 hours, he would move from one humming substation to the next, his gloved hands tracing the intricate pathways of conduits, his eyes scanning the flickering gauges for any anomaly. A slight dip in amperage, a fractional rise in temperature, any deviation was logged and cross-referenced against the master system's display. It was meticulous, monotonous work, a ghost of his old life, where the stakes were measured in volts and megawatts, not in secrets. The afternoons were dedicated to data logging. Seated at a terminal in a small, windowless office adjacent to the plant, he would compile the day's energy consumption reports, efficiency metrics, and maintenance schedules. The click of the keyboard and the soft whir of the cooling fans were the only sounds, a sterile symphony that did little to fill the profound silence that clung to the personnel. Meals in the commissary were a study in quiet isolation. Men and women in identical coveralls sat alone or in small, hushed groups, their conversations a low murmur that never rose above the clatter of cutlery. Eyes remained fixed on trays, avoiding contact. It was a community, built on a foundation of shared silence. It was in this vacuum of human connection that Sarah became a point of light. A fellow technician with tired eyes and a perpetually smudged cheek. She worked the shift opposite his, their paths crossing during the brief handover at the central control console. Their interactions were initially purely professional, a quick exchange of system statuses and work orders. But over the course of a week, the exchanges grew a few seconds longer. A shared weary glance at a particularly stubborn fluctuation in the core coolant loop. A slight, knowing shake of her head when a security patrol marched past with unnerving synchronization. One evening, as he was finishing his logs, she lingered by his doorway, a steaming mug of synthetic coffee in her hands. She spoke softly about the quirks of the older generators, the specific rattle that meant a bearing was about to go. It was the most anyone had spoken to him beyond necessity. Emboldened by this flicker of normalcy, John mentioned the oppressive feeling of the place, the way everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Posture, which had been slightly relaxed, immediately stiffened. Her eyes, which had held a glimmer of camaraderie, darted towards the hallway. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper so faint it was almost swallowed by the ambient hum. She said, there were stories, things the long-timers talked about, only when they were sure they were alone. Weird stuff. Unexplained power drains in the middle of the night from the lower levels. Sectors that weren't on any of his schematics. Sounds that didn't match any machinery on the official manifests. Her words were a hook, sinking deep into the fertile ground of his curiosity. But as soon as she saw the intense interest flare in his eyes, she recoiled. The shutters came down. She straightened up, her face smoothing into the same neutral mask worn by everyone else. She muttered something about needing to check the tertiary coolant pumps and hurried away, leaving John alone with the echo of her warning and a chilling certainty that the true horror of Permafrost Base was not the isolation, but what was being isolated deep within the mountain's frozen heart. The geothermal plant at 2 a.m. was a different beast entirely. The constant industrial hum dropped to a lower register, a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very rocks surrounding the facility. The overhead lights in the main control room were dimmed to a gloomy twilight, leaving pools of shadow to gather in the corners and beneath the sprawling console banks. John was alone, the sole guardian of the facility's mechanical heartbeat, and the silence felt less like an absence of sound and more like a physical presence, a heavy blanket smothering the world. He was running a diagnostic on the primary heat exchanger, his focus narrowed to the scrolling lines of code on his terminal screen, when he first heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was a dry, metallic sound, like a pebble being dragged along the inside of a tin pipe. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, and listened. The sound was gone, swallowed by the plant's pervasive thrum. He dismissed it, chalking it up to the normal symphony of a massive structure under stress thermal expansion. A loose panel, 100 other innocuous explanations. He returned to his work, but the silence now felt attentive, waiting. A few minutes later, the tapping returned, slightly more insistent. Tap, 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 tap. It was followed by something else, a sound that raised the fine hairs on his forearms. A whisper. It was a distorted, breathy exhalation, devoid of any recognizable words, channeled and warped by its journey through the labyrinth of ventilation shafts that spider-webbed through the base. It sounded less like a human voice and more like static given sentience, a ghost in the machine. John stood up slowly, his chair rolling back with a soft squeak that was obscenely loud in the quiet room. He walked to the nearest air vent, a grated opening high on the wall. Near the ceiling, he stood beneath it, craning his neck, his entire being focused on the metal grid. The plant hummed. The lights flickered on a dormant monitor. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then it came again, a susurrating rush of distorted sound, a chaotic jumble of sibilants and guttural rasps that seemed to coil through the ducts like a serpent. Beneath it, the rhythmic tapping continued, a steady, maddening counterpoint. He spent the next hour in a state of heightened, uneasy alertness, his routine tasks forgotten. Every groan of the infrastructure, every click of a relay, made him flinch. He found himself tracing the visible paths of the ventilation system with his eyes, trying to map the origin of the sounds. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, sometimes seeming to drift from the vent near the primary generators, other times echoing faintly from a duct near the sealed door to the lower sectors. He tried logic, listing every piece of machinery that could possibly produce such an effect: a faulty fan blade, a vibrating compressor, a pressure valve cycling irregularly. But the explanations felt hollow, paper-thin defenses against a creeping, primal dread. The whispers held a cadence that felt intentional, and the tapping was too rhythmic, too purposeful to be mere machinery. Alone in the humming half-light, John strained to decipher the secret language of the vents, the unsettling certainty growing within him that something or someone was trying to speak from the darkness just beyond the grates. The whispers had sown a seed of restless suspicion that took root deep in John's mind, flourishing in the sterile silence of his shifts. The official explanation, the hum of machinery, the natural settling of a vast structure, now felt like a flimsy curtain drawn over a disturbing truth. The following evening, armed with a high-powered flashlight and a set of fine tools from his kit, he decided to pull that curtain aside. He waited until the graveyard shift was at its quietest, the corridors empty, the commissary dark. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he approached the main ventilation shaft, access panel in a lesser-used service corridor near the geothermal plant's auxiliary control room. The panel unscrewed with a series of metallic groans that seemed deafening in the hush. The air that sighed out from the dark opening was several degrees colder, carrying the scent of aged metal and undisturbed dust. He shone his light into the cavernous duct. The beam illuminated a world of layered grime and shadow, the aluminum walls streaked with years of accumulated filth. At first glance, it was exactly what one would expect, but then his light caught on something else, something that made his breath catch. Along the bottom of the shaft, about 10 feet in, the metal was scored with a series of deep parallel scratches. They were not the random scuffs of maintenance drones. or the general wear of airflow. These were gouges clustered in specific areas, as if something had repeatedly scraped or dragged against the surface with considerable force. The pattern was unusual, deliberate, and utterly alien to any maintenance log he had ever seen. He retreated, sealing the panel with trembling hands. His mind racing, the evidence was circumstantial. But it was evidence nonetheless. It gave a physical form to the phantom sounds. His investigation, however, was far from over. Later, while performing a routine check on a power conduit that ran alongside a corridor marked Sector 7 authorized personnel only, his boots scuffed against something on the floor. He bent down, his fingers closing around a small, cool rectangle of plastic. It was an access card. Its magnetic strip worn, its corners slightly melted as if by intense heat. The name on the card was faded, unreadable, but the clearance level sent a jolt through him. It was coded for alpha-level clearance, a tier far above his own, granting access to the most restricted sectors of the base. It lay discarded near the reinforced door like a forgotten secret. Fueled by a mix of fear and a desperate need for a rational answer, he sought out Security Chief Miller. He found the man in his office, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a security monitor bank. John presented his findings carefully, mentioning the odd wear patterns in the vent, framing it as a potential structural issue. Miller listened, his expression a granite mask of indifference. When John finished, the chief offered a thin, dismissive smile. "Structural settling," he said, his voice a low, bored rumble. "The entire base was built into a living mountain," he explained. "It shifted. It groaned. It was to be expected." He thanked John for his diligence and dismissed him with a wave of his hand. The conversation closed before it had truly begun. But John's eyes, now sharpened by paranoia, saw what Miller's words tried to conceal. As he left the security office, he noticed two guards he had never seen before stationed at the end of the corridor, their postures rigid, their eyes scanning the hallway with an intensity that felt new. Over the next day, he counted 3 separate patrols passing his workstation, a frequency that was unprecedented. And when he made eye contact with a junior technician he sometimes shared the elevator with, the man's gaze skidded away instantly, a flicker of something unreadable fear or warning in his eyes before he fixed them firmly on the floor. The brush-off from Miller, the increased patrols, the averted eyes, it was not a denial of his concerns, but a confirmation. They were a silent alarm, a system reacting to his prying. The seed of suspicion had not been uprooted by Miller's dismissal. It had been watered, and now it grew into a dark, tenacious vine, twisting around his every thought, pulling him deeper into the chilling mystery of Permafrost Base. A sealed door in a place like Permafrost Base was not merely a physical barrier. It was a statement, a line drawn in the sterile, humming sand of their subterranean world. For days, the corridor leading to Sector 7 had been a part of John's peripheral existence, a passage marked with stern warnings, but otherwise unobstructed, its heavy door often left slightly ajar for authorized personnel. He had grown accustomed to its presence, another feature of the labyrinth. That morning, however, the statement had changed. The familiar door was gone, replaced by a brutal slab of reinforced steel, its surface gleaming with a cold new finish under the harsh lights. 2 armed guards flanked it, their expressions as unyielding as the metal behind them, their postures radiating an alertness that was absent from the routine patrols. The change was absolute, a sudden and violent amputation of a part of the base's anatomy. The official notice circulated on the digital bulletin board was a masterpiece of bland bureaucracy. It cited unscheduled structural reinforcement, and proactive security upgrades. Language designed to bore the reader into compliance. John stood before the new door, feeling the chill that radiated from its surface. It was more than just steel. He could see the faint outline of electromagnetic bolts, the kind used to contain explosions or riotous crowds. This was not an upgrade. This was a quarantine. The air around the corridor tasted different, tinged with the faint, acrid scent of fresh welding and something else, a coppery, ozone-like smell that clung to the back of his throat. Later, in the commissary, the silence was thicker than usual, a soup of unspoken tension. He took his tray to a secluded table, his ears straining to parse the low murmur of conversation from a group of scientists huddled nearby. Their usual clinical detachment was gone, replaced by sharp, hushed tones. He caught fragments, words that landed like physical blows in the quiet room. Complete breach of protocol. One muttered, his face pale. Can't re-establish containment on subject Epsilon. Another whispered back, her fingers nervously tapping the table. The word containment echoed in John's mind, morphing from a technical term into something monstrous. It was always about containment here, of heat, of power, of information. Now it clearly applied to something else, something that had necessitated this sudden, brutal fortification. A cold dread, far deeper than any chill the Alaskan winter could muster, began to crystallize in his gut. It was no longer a vague unease about strange sounds or furtive glances. This was a tangible, terrifying confirmation. The whispers in the vents, the scratched metal, the discarded keycard, they were not isolated anomalies. They were symptoms. The reinforced door and the armed guards were the cure, a desperate attempt to seal away a sickness festering in the facility's deepest levels. The arguments of the scientists painted a picture not of a simple mechanical failure, but of a living, breathing failure, a breach. Something that had been contained was now, at least partially, uncontained. As he sat there, the sterile hum of the base seemed to warp into a predatory purr. He was not just working in a secret facility. He was living atop a buried cage, and the thing inside had just rattled the bars so hard they had to weld the door shut. The hidden truth of Permafrost Base was no longer a whispered suspicion. It was a palpable, malevolent presence, locked behind steel, and its silence was more terrifying than any sound he had yet heard. The silence of the graveyard shift had become a canvas for the base's hidden horrors, and tonight the brushstrokes were bolder, more defined. With the reinforced door to Sector 7 standing as a silent, steel sentinel, the usual ambient sounds of permafrost, Base felt like a held breath, a fragile, quiet, waiting to be shattered. John was alone in the geothermal control hub, the schematics on his screen blurring into meaningless lines as his attention remained fixed on the grated vent high on the wall. The rhythmic tapping from previous nights had evolved. Now, it was accompanied by a new gut-wrenching sound, a soft, wet dragging like something heavy and unresisting being pulled across a rough surface. It was a sound of effort, of struggle, and it made the fine hairs on his neck stand rigid. Then came the cries. They were muffled, distorted by the labyrinth of metal ducts, but they were unmistakably vocal. These were not the staticky alien whispers of before. These were guttural, choked sounds, punctuated by sharp, hiccuping inhalations that spoke of raw terror or profound pain. They echoed down the shafts, with a clarity that felt like an invasion, each one a shard of ice driven into his spine. The official narrative of stressed machinery and structural settling crumbled to dust in his mind. Machinery did not sob. Pipes did not whimper. Driven by a compulsion that overrode his fear, he retrieved a medical stethoscope from a first-aid locker, its cold rubber tubing feeling alien in his hands. He climbed onto a maintenance crate beneath the vent, the metal groaning under his weight, and pressed the chest piece against the cold aluminum grate. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The stethoscope acted as an auditory lens, filtering out the base's low hum and magnifying the sounds from within. The dragging noise resolved into the gritty scrape of something being hauled over jointed metal seams. The muffled cries sharpened, their edges becoming heartbreakingly distinct. He heard a low, desperate moan that rose in pitch, choked off abruptly as if a hand had been clamped over a mouth. His own breath hitched. He fumbled for his personal data pad, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and activated the audio recorder, holding the stethoscope's microphone against the grate. For 30 seconds, he captured the nightmare symphony. When he played it back, his blood ran cold. Filtered through the sensitive electronics, the sounds were even clearer. Beneath the static and distortion, he could make out patterns, cadences that mimicked speech, a series of short, sharp exhalations that sounded like no, 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 a longer, drawn-out sound that resolved into a shuddering, pleading word. Please. It was fragmented, warped by its journey, but the intent was unmistakable. This was not the vocalization of an animal. This was the broken, desperate communication of a conscious mind, a being capable of fear and supplication. The last vestiges of his rationalizations collapsed. The subjects of Permafrost Base were not animals. They were something else, something that could plead for its life from the darkness, and that realization shook the foundation of his world, leaving him clinging to the cold metal of the vent, a witness to atrocity whispered through the walls. The flickering power conduit was a frantic, stuttering heartbeat. In the bowels of the facility, John traced the fault to a junction box in a disused maintenance corridor, a place where the sterile white walls gave way to raw, unfinished rock, and the air hung thick with the smell of ozone and damp concrete. The only illumination came from his headlamp, a stark beam that carved a wavering path through the oppressive gloom, making the shadows behind support beams and pipe clusters seem to twitch and writhe. He worked with a mechanic's focus, his hands moving by rote, stripping insulation and re-soldering connections, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the echo of that recorded pleading voice. The memory of it was a cold stone in his gut, a secret knowledge that poisoned every familiar sight and sound. As he tightened the final coupling, a flicker of movement at the very edge of his vision snapped his head up. His beam swept across the corridor, landing on a reinforced observation window set into the rock wall 20 feet away. It was a small, thick pane of glass, reinforced with a wire mesh, looking into a chamber that was pitch black beyond. It was a window he had never noticed before, one that wasn't on any of his schematics. For a moment, there was nothing, just the impenetrable darkness of the other side. Then a shadow detached itself from the greater blackness. It moved with an impossible fluid swiftness, a sinuous blur that crossed the space behind the window in less than a second. It was tall and unnervingly slender, its form suggesting a bipedal structure, but its motion was all wrong, a glide that seemed to defy the constraints of a normal skeletal frame. It was there, a silhouette of solid darkness against the void, and then it was gone, vanishing back into the abyss from which it had emerged. The entire glimpse lasted the span of a single frantic heartbeat. John stood frozen, his tools forgotten in his hands, his breath trapped in his lungs. The afterimage of the figure was burned onto his retinas. His mind screamed for a rational explanation. A trick of the light, a reflection, a stress-induced hallucination. But then his headlamp beam, still trained on the window, caught the proof. On the inside of the glass, where the figure had passed, a smudge was left behind, a handprint. He took a hesitant step closer, then another, his boots scuffing softly on the gritty floor. The print was stark and clear, against the clean glass. It had 5 digits, a thumb and 4 fingers. The proportions, however, were subtly off. The fingers were too long, too slender, the palm too narrow. It was a mockery of a human hand, a near-perfect replica warped just enough to scream its wrongness. The sight of it, that almost human mark left by that utterly inhuman thing, sent a wave of pure, undiluted terror crashing through him. This was no animal, no test subject. This was something from the outer edges of nightmare, a glimpse into a biology that should not exist. A soft, scraping sound from the darkness beyond the glass broke his paralysis. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled for his wrench, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the rock walls. He expected the thing to reappear, to press its distorted face against the glass, to shatter the barrier between them. But there was only silence, a deep, watchful silence that felt more threatening than any sound. The handprint remained, a silent, terrifying testament to what he had seen. The reality of Permafrost Base had fractured, and through the crack, John had seen a sliver of the impossible, leaving him alone in the dim corridor, his world view in ruins and a cold, certain dread coiling tight around his soul. The phantom handprint haunted the edges of John's vision. A ghostly afterimage burned into his mind. Every surface in the sterile, humming base now seemed a potential canvas for that distorted 5-fingered mark. He moved through his duties like an automaton, his hands performing the familiar tasks of checking relays and logging data while his thoughts spiraled in a dark, terrified loop. The control room, once his domain of orderly machinery, now felt like a stage, and he was certain that unseen eyes watched his every move from the shadows behind the vent grates. He needed something solid, something more than fleeting sounds and glimpses, to anchor his crumbling sanity. He needed proof. It was during a routine inspection of his primary workstation, a heavy, bolted-down metal desk in a recessed alcove near the geothermal core, that he found it. A loose floor tile beneath his chair had been nagging at him for days, producing a faint click whenever he shifted his weight. Finally, exasperated and desperate for any distraction, he knelt and pried it up with the edge of a screwdriver. Beneath was not the expected nest of cables, but a shallow, hollowed-out space in the concrete subfloor. And within that space lay a book. It was a standard-issue engineering log, its cover stained with dark patches that looked like old coffee rings or perhaps something else, something darker. The pages were thick, filled not with printed data, but with the tight, frantic script of handwritten entries. The first page bore a name, Alex Rourke, and a date from over a year ago. John's predecessor. His heart began to pound, a heavy, rhythmic beat against his ribs. He quickly replaced the tile and slid the journal into the inner pocket of his coveralls, the weight of it feeling like a leaden secret against his chest. He waited until he was locked in the perceived safety of his private quarters, the door bolted, the single overhead light casting a pale, inadequate glow. Then, with trembling fingers, he opened the journal. Alex Rourke's voice, captured in ink, leapt from the pages. The early entries were mundane, filled with technical observations and the same frustrations with the base's oppressive atmosphere that John himself felt. But then the tone began to shift. October 12th. Noticed a persistent power drain on their Grid 7B junction. Miller says it's a faulty sensor. The sensor checks out fine. The drain is real. October 28. The sounds are back. Louder tonight. Not just tapping. Something that sounds like humming. A distorted, broken tune. Heard it through the vent in Sector 4 access. Felt the cold dread I can't explain. John's breath caught. He was reading his own experiences, echoed from the past. He turned the page, his eyes racing over the words. November 15th. Assigned to repair a blown conduit near the Gamma observation wing. Got a look. Just a glimpse through a viewport. Subject Gamma was still. Too still. It was looking right at the one-way glass. Not pacing, not foraging. Just looking. Its eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was a recognition there, a cold, calculating awareness that froze the blood in my veins. The entries grew more frantic. December 3rd. They're lying to us. All of us. It's not animal testing. Spoke to Dr. Rice. Asked about the cognitive baseline for the Gamma subjects. He went pale, told me to never ask again. Said it was awareness beyond animal. What in God's name does that mean? December 10. I think it knows I'm watching. Sometimes the humming from the vent stops right when I enter a room. The silence that follows is worse. It's a listening silence. I've started logging everything. The patterns, the sounds, the things I see. If something happens to me. The sentence ended in a jagged line, as if the writer had been startled. John feverishly turned the page. The next one was blank, and the next. He flipped through the rest of the journal. Nothing. The final quarter of the book was empty. Alex Rourke's meticulous, terrified record ended right there, mid-thought, on December 10th. There was no conclusion, no final entry, no explanation. Just an abrupt and total silence. John sat back, the journal feeling like a block of ice in his hands. The cold dread that had been coiling in his stomach now solidified into a sharp, crystalline fear. Alex Rourke had seen what he was seeing, had heard what he was hearing, and had tried to document it. And then he was gone. Reassigned, Miller had said when John first arrived. A sudden transfer. The lie was now transparent and terrifying. The journal was not just a record. It was a warning, a message in a bottle from a man who had sailed into the same dark waters and vanished. The abrupt ending was more powerful than any final, dramatic confession. It was a void, and into that void John's own fears rushed, screaming. But alongside the terror, a new, grim resolve hardened within him. He was not going to vanish. He would not let his story end in a handful of blank pages. He had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The journal's final, unfinished sentence was a hook in his mind, pulling him toward a precipice he could no longer avoid. The weight of Alex Rourke's vanished voice was a physical pressure in his quarters, a ghost sharing The room, its silent scream echoing the pleas from the vents. He could not unsee the distorted handprint, unhear the captured whispers, unread the terrified script. The fragile shell of routine and compliance that had protected him was shattered. He needed answers, and there was only one man who could possibly provide them, even if those answers were lies that would reveal their own truth. He found Security Chief Miller in the command nexus, a room dominated by a wall of flickering monitors, showing sterile corridors and empty labs. Miller stood with his back to the door, a silhouette of rigid authority against the cold blue glow. John's footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the polished floor. Miller did not turn, but his posture shifted infinitesimally, a predator sensing a disturbance in its territory. John's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and taut, stripped of all deference. He did not mention the handprint or the fleeting shadow. He went straight to the core of it, holding up the stained journal as if it were a piece of damning evidence in a courtroom. He described the sounds, not as structural settling, but as distinct, rhythmic, and vocal. He quoted Rourke's final, chilling phrase, "Awareness beyond animal." He demanded to know what was really happening in the lowest sectors, what was being contained behind the newly fortified doors. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the servers and the soft hiss of the ventilation. Then Miller slowly turned. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes like chips of flint. He did not look at the journal. He looked through John, his gaze dissecting the insubordination. The chief's voice, when it came, was a soft, venomous thing, all the more threatening for its lack of volume. He did not answer a single question. Instead, he offered John a choice. He could forget this foolishness, return to his duties, and enjoy the remainder of his contract. Or he could be reassigned. Miller let the word hang in the air, imbuing it with a world of dark meaning. Reassignment at Permafrost Base was not a transfer to a sunnier post. It was a euphemism, the same one used for Alex Rourke. The threat was not subtle. Miller took a step closer, his bulk blocking the light from the monitors. He leaned in, his breath a cloud of stale coffee, and implied that curiosity here was not just a professional liability. It was a terminal condition. Men who asked too many questions, who poked at things best left buried in the ice, had a tendency to meet with unfortunate and final accidents. The message was clear: stand down or be erased. A cold trap seemed to snap shut around John. The walls of the command nexus felt like they were closing in, the sterile air suddenly too thin to breathe. He was a cog in a vast, murderous machine, and the chief mechanic had just threatened to hammer him into scrap. The instinct to survive, to nod, to apologize, and to retreat was a powerful, screaming impulse. But as he looked into Miller's unyielding eyes, he saw something else, a flicker of something that the threats and bluster were meant to conceal, a deep, ingrained nervousness. So, John pressed his one advantage, the phrase from the journal. He kept his voice flat, his eyes locked on Miller's. "And the sentient subjects?" he asked. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Miller's right eye, just for a fraction of a second, developed a minute, rapid twitch. The corner of his mouth tightened. It was a crack in the granite facade, a tiny seismic event that betrayed a universe of anxiety. The chief's composure returned instantly, his face hardening back into its familiar scowl. But the glimpse had been enough. The threat was real, but so was the secret. Miller's fear confirmed everything. John felt a grim, cold determination solidify within him. A resolve forged in the fire of that shared, unspoken dread. He was trapped, yes, but he was also, now, on the right path. He gave a curt, meaningless nod, turned, on his heel and walked away, feeling Miller's hostile gaze burning into his back all the way down the corridor. The confrontation was over, and the war had just begun. The plastic keycard felt like a shard of stolen ice against John's palm. Its borrowed authority a fragile shield against the suffocating protocols of Permafrost Base. Sarah had pressed it into his hand during a shift change, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own, her fingers brushing his in a fleeting, desperate gesture of solidarity before she melted back into the sterile corridors. It was a skeleton key to damnation, and he knew using it would burn the last bridge back to his old, ignorant life. That night, with the base plunged into its artificial humming slumber, he made his choice. The journey into the maze began not with a grand entrance, but with the soft, definitive click of a magnetic lock disengaging, a sound that seemed to echo with the finality of a tomb ceiling shut. The air beyond the authorized personnel-only barrier was different. Colder, heavier, carrying the faint, coppery tang of ozone and something else, something organic and stale like old blood and antiseptic. The lighting was a dim, pervasive red, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. The hum of the geothermal plant was fainter here, replaced by a deeper, more resonant thrumming that vibrated up through the soles of his boots, a rhythm that felt like the slow, monstrous heartbeat of the mountain itself. He moved like a ghost, his every sense screaming, his back prickling with the expectation of a guard shout or the searing pain of a stun bolt. The first thing he saw were the symbols. They were scratched into the painted metal of the walls at irregular intervals, gouged deep with frantic, desperate strength. They were not words, nor were they any language he recognized. They were a chaotic mix of spirals, jagged lines, and intersecting circles, some looking like crude maps of constellations, others like distorted, screaming faces. They felt ancient and profane, a frantic, unreadable graffiti left by minds pushed to the very brink of sanity. He ran his gloved fingers over one, feeling the rough, raw edges of the metal, and a cold dread settled in his stomach. This was not the work of animals. This was a testament to a consciousness screaming into the void. He passed a series of doors, each with a small, reinforced viewport. Peering through one, his breath fogging the cold glass, he saw an empty cell. It was stark and sterile, containing only a drain in the center of the floor and a metal cot bolted to the wall. But it was the restraints that held his gaze. Thick, leather straps with heavy steel buckles hung from the cot's frame, their surfaces stained dark in places. On the wall opposite the cot, at about head height, were more of the same frantic scratches, a final, futile act of defiance or communication from the room's previous occupant. The silence in the cell was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the sound from the world, and it was more horrifying than any noise. Crouching behind a bank of whirring environmental control units, he heard the murmur of voices. Two scientists in white lab coats stood under a flickering light further down the corridor, their faces drawn and pale. He strained to listen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Mimicry is advancing faster than the models predicted. One said, his voice tight with a clinical anxiety. Subject Epsilon can now replicate specific vocal patterns from the staff logs with 92% accuracy. The compliance tests are failing, the other replied, shaking her head. Perversion conditioning isn't sticking. They're learning to suppress the pain responses. Their cognitive resilience is unnatural. The words landed like physical blows. Vocal mimicry, compliance tests. The dry, technical terms stripped the horror of its mystery and laid bare its cold, mechanical cruelty. This was not an accident or a simple containment breach. This was a deliberate, systematic process. They were breaking minds, reshaping them. And the subjects were not just passive victims. They were fighting back with a terrifying, adaptive intelligence. The dread that had been a cold knot in his gut now blossomed into a full, icy certainty. He was not in a research facility. He was in a factory for nightmares, and he had just seen the assembly line. Pulling back into the shadows, John retreated, the hum of the machinery now sounding like the grinding of gears in some vast infernal machine. Each turn deepening his irreversible understanding of the abyss into which he had descended. The hum of the facility had become the soundtrack to John's unraveling, a constant, droning reminder of the invisible cage he now inhabited. The borrowed keycard felt like a brand in his pocket, its stolen potential both a lifeline and a noose. He moved through the red-lit, off-limits corridors, like a man navigating a dream, every shadow a threat, every distant echo a potential footstep. The symbols scratched into the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, their unreadable messages, a chorus of silent screams. He found a small, grated vent low on the wall in a junction between two sealed sectors, a place where the coppery antiseptic stench was particularly strong. It was an act of pure, desperate instinct that made him kneel and press his ear against the cold metal, a final, futile attempt to find some thread of reason in the madness. At first, there was only the familiar rush of forced air and the deeper, resonant thrum from the levels below. He was about to pull away, the chill of the floor seeping through his knees, when a new sound cut through the white noise. It was a voice. Not a whisper distorted by static, not a guttural cry of pain, but a voice, clear, intelligible, and horrifyingly close. It was a dry, rasping sound, stripped of emotion, as if the speaker had forgotten how to imbue words with feeling, but the enunciation was perfect, the diction crisp. "Help us," it whispered, the sound flowing from the grate like a trickle of poisoned water. "They're changing us." Time stopped. The blood in John's veins turned to ice. Every suspicion, every fragmented horror from the journal, every glimpse and whisper, coalesced into a single shattering point of understanding. The subjects were not animals. They were not monstrous, alien things. They were, or had once been, conscious beings, possibly human. The words were not a mimicked parroting of a clever beast. They were a plea, a statement of fact from a mind that knew what was being done to it, that understood its own destruction, and was begging for intervention. A moral shockwave tore through him, so violent it felt physical. He slumped back from the vent, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a gasp. His stomach churned, a hot rush of bile scalding his throat. "They're changing us." The clinical terms from the scientists, vocal mimicry, compliance tests, cognitive resilience shattered their sterile shells and revealed the raw, screaming truth within. This was torture. This was a systematic dismantling of identity, a forced metamorphosis into something broken and compliant. And he, John, with his wrenches and his data logs, his meticulous maintenance of the power relays and environmental systems, was a part of the machine that made it possible. He kept the lights on. He kept the air flowing. He maintained the very infrastructure of this horror. His role here was not that of a simple technician. It was that of a jailer, a facilitator of atrocity. The geothermal plant he so carefully tended wasn't just providing power for lights and heat. It was fueling the nightmare in the depths. Every dial he adjusted, every conduit he repaired, was another brick in the wall of this silent, screaming prison. The weight of that complicity settled on his shoulders, a crushing burden. He had been so focused on uncovering the truth. He had never stopped to consider what he would do when he found it. Now, the truth had found him, spoken in a clear, desperate whisper from the darkness, and it had imprinted on his soul a stain of guilt that he knew, with a sickening certainty, would never wash away. He was no longer just a witness. He was, by his inaction, a participant. The whispered plea from the vent had redefined the very air John breathed, transforming the sterile atmosphere of Permafrost Base into a medium of shared guilt and suffocating horror. He could no longer walk the corridors as a mere employee. He was now a conspirator, his hands metaphorically stained by the silent screams his work sustained. The need for irrefutable proof, for something more than auditory phantoms and frantic journal entries, became a physical ache, a desperate hunger that overrode the primal fear screaming at him to flee, to hide, to forget. He remembered the discarded, but high-level access card, its worn surface a key, not just to a door but to the black heart of the facility. He waited for the shift change, when the nocturnal quiet was at its deepest, and the patrols were at their most predictable. The card felt heavy and illicit in his hand as he slipped into a disused data archiving room, a place forgotten by time and progress, filled with the dusty ghosts of obsolete technology. In a shadowy corner, behind a stack of decommissioned server racks, stood a lone terminal, its screen dark, its casing yellowed with age. It was a relic, likely overlooked during system upgrades. A backdoor into a past the facility was desperate to bury. He swiped the card. A soft beep. The screen flickered to life, casting a sickly green glow onto his face in the darkness. The system recognized the alpha level clearance, granting him access to files that were never meant to be seen. He navigated through layers of encrypted directories, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found them labeled not with names, but with code, alphanumeric codes. Project Chimera. The logs were clinical, dispassionate, and utterly monstrous. They detailed the acquisition of assets, political prisoners, dissidents, and ideological non-compliant individuals deemed expendable by the shadowy machinery of the Cold War. They were not volunteers, they were raw materials. The documents outlined a process of neurological recalibration and behavioral optimization, using a brutal cocktail of psychoactive drugs, sensory deprivation, and targeted pain induction to break down independent thought and instill absolute obedience. The goal was not just to create spies, but to forge living weapons, pliable assassins and infiltrators who could pass for human until the trigger was pulled, their original identities erased, replaced with programmed directives. This was the unimaginable cruelty, laid bare in stark, bureaucratic text. His eyes, burning with a mixture of terror and rage, scanned the final log entry. It referenced a live field demonstration. Attached was a video file, its label simply Asset Gamma 7. With a trembling finger, he clicked it open. The feed was grainy, blurred as if filmed through a smeared lens. The colors washed out. It showed a sterile white room, not unlike an interrogation cell. A figure sat on a metal stool, clad in a plain gray jumpsuit. Its posture was slumped, defeated. A voice, filtered and emotionless from an off-screen speaker, issued a command. "State your designation." The figure on the stool lifted its head. The face was gaunt, the eyes hollow, but they held a flicker of agonized awareness. When it spoke, its voice was raspy, strained, but the words were chillingly coherent. "My name was Lieutenant Arkady Petrov. I served with the voice faltered, a spasm of pain twisting its features. It was fighting, a shred of its former self struggling against the programming. Then, the horror began. The figure's body went rigid, its back arching violently as an unseen force seized it. A low, guttural sound, devoid of humanity, tore from its throat. Its eyes, which had held a glimmer of coherent identity, rolled back, becoming blank, milky orbs. The transformation was swift and brutal, a puppet having its strings yanked by a cruel master. The coherent man was gone, submerged beneath a wave of forced compliance, replaced by a twitching, empty vessel. The video feed cut to black. John stared at the dock screen, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The terminal's hum was the only sound in the dead silence of the archive room. The clinical logs had described the theory, but the video had shown him the practice. He had just watched a man's soul being systematically extinguished, his mind broken and reshaped into a tool. The whispered pleas, the frantic scratching, the almost human handprint, it all snapped into a devastating clear focus. This was not science. This was a sacrilege, factory of suffering operating in the frozen dark, and he now held its blueprints in his trembling, guilty hands. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a crushing, unbearable weight, and it had just condemned him forever. The truth was a parasite, and it had burrowed deep into the fabric of John's mind, feeding on his sanity. In the days that followed his discovery in the archive room, Permafrost Base transformed from a place of work into a sprawling, sentient prison designed specifically for him. The sterile white corridors were no longer just hallways. They were the winding intestines of a beast that knew he was inside it, and he could feel its awareness like a pressure change in his skull. Every hum from the geothermal plant was no longer the sound of machinery, but the beast's low, predatory purr. Every flicker of the fluorescent lights was a deliberate, mocking blink. Paranoia became his constant companion, a whispering second shadow that dogged his steps. He felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him at all times. The glossy black domes of the security cameras were no longer passive observers. They were unblinking pupils, their lenses focused with malevolent intent solely on him. He started taking different routes to the same destinations, weaving through the base in a futile attempt to throw off his surveillance. The few personnel he passed in the halls were no longer just colleagues. They were potential informants, their neutral expressions masks, hiding a deep, conspiratorial knowledge. He found himself analyzing their micro-expressions, the way a technician's eyes might linger on him for a fraction of a second too long, or how a guard's hand might rest a little too casually on his stun baton. Even Sarah, his only flicker of an ally, now seemed suspect. Had her help been a trap? Was her fear a carefully rehearsed performance to lure him deeper? Sleep offered no refuge. His dreams were vivid, suffocating tapestries of terror. He was running through endless, red-lit corridors that mirrored the restricted sectors, his breath sawing in his lungs, the frantic, scratched symbols on the walls twisting into screaming faces. In one recurring nightmare, he was the one strapped to the metal cot, staring up at the distorted five-fingered handprint on the ceiling as a filtered, emotionless voice demanded he state his designation. He would wake drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of leather restraints still tight on his wrists, the echo of the command ringing in his ears. The line between the nightmare and his waking life began to blur, the dread of his dreams leaching into the sterile reality of his quarters. Driven by a desperate need to cling to some semblance of reason, he began to document everything. In a small, leather-bound notebook he had brought from his old life, he started recording his own observations, with the frantic precision of a man building a dam against a rising tide of madness. He noted the times he felt the most, watched the patterns of the patrols, the names and shifts of guards who seemed to pay him undue attention. He sketched the symbols from the walls, their chaotic spirals and jagged lines looking even more sinister in his own hand. But he wrote in a tiny, cramped script, hiding the notebook inside a hollowed-out panel in his quarters, terrified that his own observations would become the final piece of evidence used against him. If they discovered what he knew, he would no longer be the technician. He would become the subject. His maintenance coveralls would be exchanged for a gray jumpsuit, his tools for restraints. His own mind would be the next system to be recalibrated, his identity the next file to be encrypted and buried. The weight of this knowledge, coupled with the crushing guilt of his complicity, frayed the edges of his consciousness. He was a man standing on a disintegrating ledge, the abyss of Permafrost Base yawning beneath him, its cold breath whispering promises of a final, terrible compliance. The ledge was gone, crumbled into the abyss, and now there was only the fall. John's psychological descent had bottomed out into a cold, clear-eyed resolve. The paranoia did not vanish, but it transformed, sharpening from a debilitating fear into a tool for survival. He was a rat in a maze, designed by monsters, and the only way out was to chew through the walls. He would not wait to be reassigned, to vanish into the blank pages of a journal like Alex Rourke. He would escape Permafrost Base, and he would not go empty-handed. He would carry its terrible truth out with him, a shard of frozen hell to hold up to the outside world. His quarters became a war room, a silent, clandestine headquarters for a one-man rebellion. During the day, he performed his duties with robotic efficiency, his face a mask of weary compliance, all while his mind catalogued every detail of the facility's layout. At night, by the dim, sanctioned light of his desk lamp, he worked. He retrieved a sheaf of drafting paper from an old supply locker and began to sketch. His hand, trained for technical schematics, now mapped a path to salvation. He drew the labyrinth of the upper levels, the service corridors he knew intimately, marking camera blind spots and the patrol schedules he had memorized. Then, with more hesitation, he began to sketch the red-lit maze of the restricted sectors from memory, his lines wavering as he marked the location of the vent where he had heard the clear, desperate voice, the cell with the stained restraints, the archive room with the forgotten terminal. The map was a patchwork of certainty and guesswork, a fragile cartography of hope and terror. Next came the evidence. He waited for a moment when the network traffic was at its peak, during a shift change when system diagnostics were run. Using a series of backdoor commands he remembered from his army days, he accessed the Project Chimera files from his authorized terminal, his heart thundering as the encrypted data streamed across the screen. He worked quickly, his movements economical and precise. He copied everything: the acquisition logs, the neurological recalibration protocols, the cold, brutal progress reports. He saved the grainy, soul-destroying video of Asset Gamma 7. All of it was transferred to a tiny, high-capacity data drive, no larger than his thumbnail, which he then secreted inside a hollowed-out compartment in the heel of his work boot. The weight of it was negligible, but it felt like he was carrying an entire screaming universe in his shoe. He began to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere around him, a confirmation that his preparations had not gone entirely unnoticed. The security patrols past his workstation became more frequent, their pace slower, their eyes scanning his alcove with a new, penetrating intensity. The once random sweeps of the ceiling cameras now seemed to linger on him with a focused curiosity. He felt the gaze of the beast, its attention narrowing, its purr deepening. He was running out of time. He needed an ally, a second set of eyes, someone to watch his back. There was only one person he could even consider. He cornered Sarah in a quiet moment between the primary and secondary coolant pump rooms, the thunder of the machinery providing a curtain of sound. He spoke in a low, urgent whisper, his eyes pleading. He didn't give her the full, horrifying truth, but he told her enough. That the base was a prison, that people were being hurt, that he had a way out, and he needed her help to make it happen. Sarah's face, usually a careful mask of weary endurance, crumpled. The flicker of solidarity he had seen before was extinguished, replaced by a raw, primal fear. She shook her head, her eyes wide and glassy, her hands trembling as she clutched a wrench. She leaned in so close he could feel her breath warm and frantic against his ear. Her words were not a refusal, but a death sentence. "No one leaves Permafrost Base alive, John," she whispered, the sound barely audible over the pump's roar. "They don't reassign people. They bury them in the ice. Please, just stop. Before they bury you too." She pulled away, her face hardening back into the familiar, vacant mask, and hurried off, leaving him alone in the thunderous room. Her warning was not a threat. It was a eulogy. It slammed into him with the force of a physical blow, extinguishing the last ember of hope for a shared escape. He was truly alone. The map in his pocket felt like a childish fantasy, the data drive in his heel, a useless trinket. The beast was awake, it was watching, and it had just reminded him of the one immutable rule of its domain. No one ever left. The desperation that flooded him was colder and darker than the Alaskan permafrost, a freezing certainty that his plan was not just dangerous, but doomed. The final layer of encryption yielded not with a bang, but with a soft digital sigh, a whisper of surrendering, code that felt obscenely gentle for the cataclysm it unleashed. John sat in the claustrophobic darkness of the archive room, the terminal's sickly green glow etching deep shadows into his haggard face. Sarah's warning was a cold stone in his gut. Her words, they bury them in the ice, echoing in the silent spaces between his heartbeats. But retreat was no longer an option. He was a man digging his own grave, and he had to see the bottom. The files he had copied were a start, but they were the official record, the sanitized version of hell. He needed the raw truth, the unvarnished blueprint of the atrocity. He needed the project's genesis, its true, unflinching purpose. He navigated to a directory so deeply buried it felt like descending into a geological stratum of lies. The file was labeled simply, Prospero Mandate. It was protected by a final, brutal encryption wall, a cipher that would have taken a government server farm years to crack. But John had an advantage. Alex Rourke's journal, that desperate message from the grave, had not just contained terrified ramblings. Scattered amidst the frantic script were strings of numbers, dates, and alphanumeric sequences that had seemed like nonsense. Now, with the cold clarity of desperation, John saw them for what they were. Keys. He entered the final sequence, a string of characters Rourke had scribbled beside a sketch of one of the frantic wall symbols. The screen flickered, and the file opened. What he read there dismantled the last of the world he thought he knew. Project Chimera was not merely about creating spies or obedient soldiers. That was the cover, the palatable lie for the bureaucrats and funders. The Prospero Mandate revealed the true, hideous ambition. Its goal was the systematic creation of psychologically broken assets, human weapons so utterly shattered and remade that they were less than ghosts. The documents detailed the science of soul murder, a precise methodology for using extreme sensory deprivation, controlled torture, and pharmacological conditioning to not just suppress, but completely erase individual identity. The subjects were to be hollowed out, their memories, their personalities, their very sense of self scoured away until nothing remained but a void. Into that void a new, single-purpose consciousness could be implanted, an absolute loyalty to a handler, a fanatical devotion to a mission, with no past, no moral compass, and no fear of death to interfere. They weren't being changed. They were being unmade. A cold, sickening clarity washed over him, so profound it was almost peaceful. He finally understood the facility's true nature. Permafrost Base was not a research outpost. It was a black site, a clandestine workshop operating in a legal and moral vacuum, a place where the unthinkable could be engineered in frozen secrecy. Its remote location, its absolute isolation, its culture of silent terror, it was all by design. This was a machine for manufacturing human weapons, and it needed a specific brutal environment to function. And then, the final personal blow landed. His eyes scanned a subsection titled Environmental Precise. It detailed the necessity of a perfectly stable, self-contained power grid. Fluctuations in temperature, interruptions in lighting cycles, even minor variances in atmospheric pressure could disrupt the delicate, torturous process of neurological dismantling. The subject's mind, in its death throes, was hypersensitive. Any inconsistency in their artificial environment could provide an anchor, a shred of reality to cling to, potentially ruining months of costly, brutal work. His maintenance work. The power relays he calibrated with such meticulous care. The geothermal conduits he kept humming. The environmental systems he logged and balanced every single day. He wasn't just a facilitator. He was the custodian of the torture chamber. He was the man who kept the lights on, and the temperature perfect so that the work of erasing human beings could proceed without a hitch. Every time he had fixed a faulty connection, every time he had prevented a power dip, he had been ensuring that the screams from the vents remained muffled, that the identities in the cells below were systematically and efficiently annihilated. His hands, which had only ever touched tools and keyboards, were now stained with a complicity more intimate and damning than any guards or scientists. He had been an essential, if unwitting, gear in the infernal machine, and the realization triggered a crisis of conscience so violent it felt like his soul was being torn in two. The truth was no longer something he knew. It was something he had helped build, and the weight of it threatened to crush him into dust. The klaxon's shriek was a physical force, tearing through the sterile silence of Permafrost Base like a claw of pure sound. Red emergency lights strobed, painting the white corridors in pulses of arterial crimson, turning the familiar labyrinth into a disorienting funhouse of panic. John's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat syncopated with the alarm. He ran, his boots pounding a desperate rhythm on the polished floor, the stolen map of the emergency exits a burning image behind his eyes. The data drive hidden in his heel felt like a lead weight, a tiny, screaming conscience driving him forward. He had to reach the surface, to carry the truth out of this frozen tomb, to expose the abomination he had helped sustain. He rounded a corner and skidded to a halt, his breath catching in his throat. The path to the nearest emergency exit was blocked. Security Chief Miller stood flanked by 4 guards, their stun rifles raised and leveled. Miller's face was a granite mask of cold triumph, his eyes devoid of anything but a predatory finality. The red light washed over them, making their features stark and demonic. There was no surprise in his expression, only the grim satisfaction of a hunter who had finally run his quarry to ground. "The game's over," Technician Miller's voice cut through the siren's wail, flat and absolute. He took a step forward, the guards mirroring his movement, a wall of advancing, implacable force. John's mind raced, calculating the shrinking distance, the hopeless odds. Surrender was a return to the cell, to the cot with the stained restraints, to the final blank page of Alex Rourke's journal. Fighting was a swift and certain death. The choice was a chasm with no safe side, and then the choice was ripped away. A deafening metallic groan echoed from a side corridor. The sound of rending steel and shattering locks. One of the reinforced doors, identical to the one that had sealed Sector 7, burst inward, its frame twisted and mangled. From the darkness beyond, a figure lunged into the strobe-lit hall. It moved with a jerky, spasmodic grace, its form a gaunt silhouette against the emergency red. It was the subject. It was taller than a man, its limbs elongated and thin, its movements a chaotic blend of humanoid structure and unnatural articulation. It did not charge the guards. It flowed around them, a phantom, a frantic, broken motion. One of the guards fired, a blue arc of electricity crackling through the air, but the subject was already elsewhere, its form a blur. It was not attacking with purpose, but with the desperate, cornered fury of a tortured thing that had finally snapped its chains. In that chaotic swirl of red light and shouting, John locked eyes with it. For a single, frozen second, the world narrowed to that gaze. The subject's eyes were not the milky, blank orbs from the video feed. They were wide, dark, and terrifyingly human. They were windows into a soul that was still present, still fighting, but drowning in an ocean of pain and madness. They held a bottomless torment, a silent, screaming plea that was more articulate than any word, whispered through a vent. In their depths, John saw the ghost of Lieutenant Arkady Petrov, the echo of every dissident and prisoner, the accumulated agony of every identity systematically unmade. It was a look of profound, existential suffering, a condemnation, and a plea fused into one. The moment shattered as Miller bellowed an order. 2 guards tackled the subject, driving it to the floor with brutal force. It thrashed wildly, a raw, guttural sound tearing from its throat, not a roar of anger, but a sob of ultimate despair. A 3rd guard jammed a syringe into its neck. The frantic struggle ceased almost instantly, the subject's body going limp, its head lolling to the side, those tormented human eyes still open, fixed on the ceiling, seeing nothing. The confrontation was over. The immediate threat was neutralized. Miller's cold gaze swung back to John. The guards, their weapons now trained solely on him, began to advance again. The choice, once a theoretical chasm, was now a razor's edge before him. He could raise his hands, surrender to the inevitable reassignment, and become another nameless entry in the Prospero Mandate logs, his mind scoured clean, his identity buried in the ice. Or he could fight. He could lunge, grab for a weapon, make them kill him here and now. A final, messy, and ultimately futile act of defiance. The data drive in his heel was a cold, hard promise against his skin. The memory of those human eyes was a burning brand on his soul. He stood poised between the void of surrender and the fire of a hopeless fight. The klaxon's scream, the only elegy for the choice he was about to make. The world dissolved into a storm of chaos and adrenaline. The klaxon's scream, the shouts of the guards, the lingering image of those tormented human eyes. It all fused into a single primal command: run. As Miller and his men were momentarily distracted by the subdued subject, a sliver of opportunity, thin as a razor's edge, presented itself. A maintenance hatch, marked for emergency ventilation access, stood slightly ajar just behind John, its lock lightly damaged in the containment breach. He didn't think. He moved. He slammed the heavy hatch shut behind him, plunging himself into absolute darkness, and threw his weight against the manual locking wheel, sealing himself in just as furious pounding erupted on the other side. He was in a vertical shaft, a cold, metallic throat that smelled of grease and frozen air. The ladder was ice-cold against his bare hands, but he climbed, driven by a terror that was stronger than the ache in his muscles or the burn in his lungs. He climbed past groaning ductwork, through clouds of condensation that froze on his lashes, his world reduced to the next rung, the next desperate pull upwards. He could hear the muffled shouts and alarms fading below, but he knew they would be coming. They would know every access point, every potential exit. He had to be a ghost. After an eternity of climbing, his numbed fingers found a final hatch. He shoved it open, and the Alaskan night swallowed him whole. The cold was a physical assault, a billion frozen needles driven into his exposed skin. The wind howled, whipping stinging sheets of snow that blinded him and erased the world beyond a few feet. He stumbled away from the base's hidden entrance, a mere discoloration in the mountainside, and plunged into the white void. He ran until his legs gave way, collapsing into a deep drift, his body shuddering uncontrollably. He was free, but the wilderness was another kind of prison, vast, indifferent, and lethally cold. For days, he moved like a phantom through the endless white. He used his basic survival training to find shelter in a rocky overhang, to melt snow for water. He was hunted not just by the elements, but by the memories that stalked the corridors of his mind. In the silence of the tundra, broken only by the wind's mournful cry, the sounds of Permafrost Base echoed with terrifying clarity. He heard the rhythmic tapping in the creak of shifting snow, the distorted whispers in the rustle of icy pine boughs. He saw the gaunt, jerking figure in every shadowed tree, the tormented eyes in the reflective gleam of ice. The horror was no longer outside him. It had been internalized, a parasite feeding on his sanity. He would wake from frozen sleep, screaming into the gale, the phantom sensation of leather straps tight on his wrists. He had escaped with his life, but the evidence was pitifully small. The data drive was a sliver of digital truth in a world of lies. The map was a crude sketch. His own testimony was the ravings of a traumatized man. Who would believe him? A disgraced army technician versus the implacable, anonymous power that ran a place like Permafrost Base. They would bury his story under layers of official denial, label him unstable, a deserter, a liar. One evening, huddled in his meager shelter as an aurora bled, green and violet across the star-flecked sky, he knew what he had to do. His fingers, clumsy and numb, fumbled with his personal recorder, its battery life flickering in the cold. He pressed record, his voice a raw, broken thing against the vast silence. "My name is John," he began, the wind stealing his words. He spoke of the whispers, the journal, the handprint, the eyes. He described the Prospero Mandate in halting, horrified terms. He laid out the entire terrible architecture of the truth. When he finished, a profound exhaustion settled over him. He stared at the tiny red recording light, a single point of man-made certainty in the primordial dark. "I don't know if anyone will ever hear this," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I don't know if anyone will believe me." He fell silent, the only sound, the eternal, keening wind. In the world he had left behind, the official story would be one of a tragic accident, a catastrophic systems failure, a cover-up, seamless and absolute. But in the shadows, in the hushed conversations of those who knew a sliver of the truth, rumors would linger. Whispers of a facility buried in the ice, of things that were done there, of a man who had seen the abyss and fled into the storm. The rumors would be denied, of course, dismissed as conspiracy and fantasy, but they would persist, a chilling, open-ended horror, a ghost in the machine of the known world, waiting in the frozen silence for the next curious